But we pioneered this idea that you can sacrifice latency in order to gain huge amounts of cost savings, specifically infrastructure cost savings. I mean, the thing that people need to understand about Iceberg is that it's a table format, it's a building block. Everyone's like, oh, good PMs are right a lot. You're wrong, like almost all the time. You just have to be wrong in the right direction.
Hey there, everybody. I'm Tim Berglund, and welcome to Confluent Developer, the podcast where we explore the fascinating journeys of software developers tackling complex problems. In this episode, I talked to Caleb Grillo, the staff product manager for Confluent WarpStream. Caleb recounts his story starting as a PM in the early days of Confluent Cloud, talking about billing and a maturing platform, and then later joining an exciting young startup, WarpStream, in late 2023. WarpStream at the time was busy turning the world of Kafka upside down, and Caleb tells the whole story from the perspective of a data-driven product manager who is always wrong in somebody's eyes. Caleb tells a great story, and now we get to listen in. Hey, Caleb, welcome to the show.
Hey, Tim, how's it going?
Going all right. Going all right. Good to have you here.
Yeah.
Hey, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure.
What are you doing these days?
Yeah. So I'm Caleb. I'm our product lead for the WarpStream product line at Confluent, which is our BYOC product line. So bring your own cloud. So we'll get into all the details of that, but yeah, I run our product management function here, and so that day to day, everything's different every day. So no 2 days are really the same for me. But I work across our engineering team to figure out what we're building and whether it's the right thing for our customers, and make sure that we're prioritizing all the right things. But I also do a fair amount of sort of analytics work. Digging into sort of how people are using our product. And I also work on sort of the business side, the GTM, making sure that our sort of commercials make sense and sort of integration with the larger Confluent business and all that. So it's a pretty
that's a lot.
Knee deep, mile wide type role.
What do you mean analytics? I thought being a PM was just vibes. You're saying you use data?
No. Yeah, we all of our consumption data and all of our usage data goes into Confluent's data warehouse. And so we're able to sort of do like trend analysis on things like revenue and, cost, and make sure that our cost and margin makes sense and all that stuff. Yeah. So it's
good. It's good to have that, because I've said there's probably a lot of reasons why I'm not a product manager, like, maybe qualification or something, but
I think you'd be a great one, Tim.
Well, here's the thing though. Here's the thing. When you're PM, like every decision you make is to a significant fraction of your stakeholders, not just wrong, but like, how could you be that stupid wrong?
Yes.
It's this process of being idiotically wrong all the time. In somebody's eye, like 40, 50% of the people think that all the time. I got into a line of work where I get like the constant affirmation that I need, like being on stage and stuff like that. So I think it's really just an inner thing. I need people to tell me how awesome I am. You need the strength of character to do the right thing, even when they tell you you're wrong. And you have that.
I think to be a really great product person, you have to be a glutton for punishment.
Yep.
And you have to. Everyone's like, "Oh, good PMs are right a lot." You're wrong, like almost all the time. You just have to be wrong in the right direction.
Yeah, and in terms of like objective results, you're right or wrong, you could come up with some rubric for scoring that. Somebody thinks you're wrong all the time.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, you're just you're a moron all the time, and that I would struggle. What was your first job?
Yeah, my first job out of college was not. My first job ever was washing windows in high school.
Nice.
I had one of my brother's friends. I have an older brother. One of my brother's friends had a window washing business, and we'd go around people's houses and wash their windows. That was my first job ever. It was like a summer job. My first serious job out of college, I worked for an international development NGO. And so, it was really interesting. We did a lot of work for like USAID, the Agency for International Development, but also for sort of UN agencies and other things like that. And so, and it was really global. Like there were projects in all kinds of different places and different countries and continents. I didn't get to travel very much, just because I moved on to tech before I sort of got into travel related work. But that role was kind of interesting. I was working on proposal budgeting. So there's like a technical portion of these sort of project proposals, and there's a cost component. And so I was working on the cost component, which is figuring out how much does a Toyota Land Cruiser cost in Uganda, and putting that into budget proposals and things like that. So yeah, I mean it was sort of interesting. I guess you could. I didn't at the time think of it this way, but you could draw some parallels between that and product management. Making sure that all the pieces fit together and make sense. But I mean that was my first job out of college.
There you go. Window washing prepares you for product management only if your customers berate you about what a terrible job you did washing windows.
Yeah, that's right.
All right.
Yeah. Too slow.
Yeah, that's right. Too slow. You washed the wrong window pane first, and the pattern you used was wrong.
I read in a book somewhere that you were supposed to do it some other way.
There you go. There's this Wikipedia page.
Yes.
Tell us about, I think you kind of hinted this, but what's the most interesting problem you ever solved to date?
Yeah. So, well, I guess I can start with my character arc, because that'll sort of explain my answer.
I love that. Yeah.
So I got into tech after a couple of years of working for the International Development NGO. I got into tech in sort of a business operations role, and then moved into product management a couple of years later. And one of my first product jobs was dealing with a lot of the streaming data at an e-commerce site. That's not Amazon. And so we were basically building a data platform for competitive intelligence data. So lots of high volume data that was being like scraped from various places on the internet, basically building a huge data lake of all that information. So teams like, data analytics and data science could figure out which products were going to sell well against others, and things like that. Which sites were listing all these different products, how the review counts were correlating with, and review ratings were correlating with like listing those products and surfacing them on competitor sites, basically trying to learn what was going on in the market from external data sources instead of just our own internal analytics. Mm-hmm. And that pipeline, like the ingest pipeline, was Kafka. So this was 2017, 2018.
Okay, that was around the start of my own Kafka journey.
Yeah. Similar tracks, I guess. And so, I came to learn about Confluent when I was in that role, and we solved a lot of interesting problems. But I kind of realized, like, okay, there's like a more scalable way to do this, like to go to Confluent and work on the technology underpinning this whole thing. I just got super interested in that, and so I ended up moving over to Confluent in May 2019. And when I started, we had a sort of you'll remember this, we had a sort of disjoint like product lineup. There was a cloud product that had gained a lot of traction, but that cloud product was not really what you would expect from like commercially from a cloud product. Meaning like it wasn't like AWS where you spin up an EC2 instance and you start being billed hourly for that instance, and you spin it down and you stop being billed. There was like no possibility of self-serve anything in that version of our cloud product.
It's in our defense back then, it's very hard to make a cloud service. And so that was, of course, it was super primitive. Yeah.
And it was a proof of concept. Like it was like will people use a streaming platform hosted by somebody else? Yes, that was proven that they would, and it went too far.
We got carried away. It went crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, I got carried away with the proof of concept, and then it was time to make it a real product. And so when I came in at Confluent, that was kind of the state. There was like, the big cloud business was this sort of interesting hybrid of like a hosted service, but it wasn't really what you'd expect from like a fully managed cloud product. It was sort of just, we'll run your Kafka brokers for you. And
Kafka on some servers is
yeah,
how I
yeah, yeah,
describe it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And we wanted, like, the vision for Confluent Cloud was always to be way more than that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Serverless.
so yeah, and so like the biggest the sort of biggest blocker that we had, other than sort of the hard technical things of building a real cloud service, we had the underpinnings of that, but like we were limited by the commercial model. And so that was sort of the big problem that needed to be solved back in 2019, was like, how do we make the commercial model work in order to unlock sort of this self-serve cloud vision of a cloud product that everybody had. And sort of central to that was building out the consumption-based billing system. And so Confluent had a consumption-based billing system already, but it was for their self-serve cloud product. So there were two different products. There was the non-self-serve, serious usage, dedicated infrastructure, hosted brokers product.
Yeah,
and there was another product. Yeah, and there was another product that was kind of just like, go sign up for this thing, put in your credit card, it's self-serve. That was all multi-tenant clusters. So like there were all the underpinnings that we needed to sort of put everything together, but it was impossible to marry those two worlds together without the commercial model making sense.
Okay.
And so in order to have a consumption-based commercial model, you had to have a consumption-based billing system that could handle, all the different sort of cluster types you'd need and all the different infrastructure. Like there's, Kafka Connect, there's KSQL. At the time, Flink wasn't there, but you needed to be sort of able to support all these different products and different like cluster types, and you need to be able to meter throughput and storage and like all the different usage metrics. And so building out the first version of that was kind of welcome to Confluent. Here's this huge project. You need to go figure out how to do it.
Now a quick word from our sponsor. Confluent Developer, the podcast, is brought to you by Confluent Developer, the website, which has everything you need as a developer of data streaming systems. And it's completely free. We've got curriculum, hands-on exercises, executable tutorials, the online data streaming engineer certification, also free, a way to find a meetup near you, those are free. Everything is there. I really want you to be successful in your journey as a data streaming engineer, and this is the site that has what you need. Check it out at developer.confluent.io. That's developer.confluent.io. Now back to the show. And you and I were coworkers then, but remind me, were you a PM or an engineer? Where were you then?
I was a PM. Yeah. Okay. So I started at Confluent as a PM, and so that was the first sort of thing to figure out, and that involved like it was hugely cross-functional, which is a hard thing in itself.
Always, yeah.
Meaning I had to work like with engineering, but also all the other PMs with running all their other services, and also the sales team, and the marketing team. Like the whole way things happened at Confluent had to shift. It wasn't just, let's just build a billing system and build it and they will come. Like we had to make everything work. The finance team, like we had weekly meetings with 10 different heads of X in the room trying to figure out sort of what we were doing. And so that was difficult. It was also technically difficult because, like any metering, like at the time there weren't these nice SaaS tools that you could buy to sort of solve the technical underpinning of your billing system. Like every company that wanted to do this had to build their own system.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so we had already built, before I got there was like this sort of pre-existing metering system. But it didn't support, for example, having multiple cluster tiers. We couldn't have like a dedicated cluster and a multi-tenant cluster sitting next to each other being built. So we had to like build that in. There's also, this is getting into sort of boring business stuff, but like there's a concept of like a commit or like a minimum commitment that, a customer would make in order to have sort of a long-term deal with Confluent. And building that concept into the billing system, like we had to do that because your usage gets metered, but you can't just meter it at list price if somebody's getting a discount. So we needed a concept of a discount. Like there were like all these things we had to model in, and sort of we were changing the wheels on the 747 as it was coming in for a landing. That's the metaphor I like to use.
Customers using the platform at this point.
Yes. Yeah. That's true. And then we had to come up with a strategy for migrating people over and making sure that the pricing made sense. And like, we're trying to merge all these worlds together. So it was very, very interesting and very, very high impact, but also very hard, to get it right. And, I don't think we got it 100% right the first time. But we built it in a way that was like, that it could, in theory, support all the future iterations that you currently see in Confluent Cloud.
Yeah.
And it's totally different now. It's like a completely different system. The technical side of it was also super interesting because, the infrastructure under the hood is, throwing off all sorts of metrics. You can measure all kinds of stuff, and figuring out like what pipelines, like what parts of the observability pipeline would be suitable for billing was kind of that was a challenge in itself. Figuring out which metrics meant the things that they needed to mean when it comes to billing, because that's a different problem than observability.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, it was a big undertaking, but I think that I learned a ton. It's a great introduction to a company. And be like, hey, come and just like change everything about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Totally cross-functionally, different agendas, different different incentive structures, different personalities, and you make it all work.
Yeah. The technical side of it also was super cool. I don't want to minimize that. Like that was, for me, very interesting to figure out like how to translate all of these different requirements, very specific, like, like gigabytes of writes, like writes to the cluster, like means something specific. There's like 6 different metrics that you could potentially think would be, used for measuring writes, and what's the right one. And so, there's stuff like that. And then, different, like, I guess if somebody wants to be able to do per second billing, it's like, well, actually we want to aggregate things hourly and present it hourly to like there were lots of arguments about like what specific things we did, and we had to figure out like what was supportable with the current platform.
And when you have things like bandwidth limitations and things like that, that implies a measurement regime and a time grandeur. There's all kinds of things that have to be true, that are their own engineering problems to solve, and dirty secret in any given system that has a thing like that, that might be over the whole day or so, it isn't necessarily like an instantaneous thing. It just depends on what you've built, and it's all hard in its own way.
Yeah, this was something that was interesting that we always had to explain to people. It was like there's like a period of time where when you like log into the UI and you look at the billing screen, there's a period of time where the amounts can change. That like broke people's brains when you were trying to explain this to customers. They were like, and this was, 2019, 2020, 6 years ago. People would look at that statement and be like, wait, but can I trust your billing system? And be like, yeah, we have all these correctness checks and everything's good. It's just that there can be some late arriving metrics. Like this is a massive distributed system of distributed systems. Like you can have stuff happen, but don't worry, like your monthly bill is fine.
It'll converge. It'll
converge, right?
So you ended up fast forwarding a little bit at WarpStream. How'd you get there?
So I had been at Confluent for about 5 years. And actually, it came about basically because Rishi, one of the co-founders of WarpStream, posted this blog post, which is now very famous, called "Kafka is Dead, Long Live Kafka." And all the ideas that they were putting out there were just very interesting. They were basically saying that like there's this category of workload where Kafka is a super low latency real time system. There's this category of workload that doesn't need to be super low latency. Like it's not extremely latency sensitive. And I remember this, for years and years, it was just like, it wasn't even a thought that could cross your mind that you could differentiate a product on latency. It was like, no, it's just fixed constraint. It's a real time system. Latency must be small.
It's is it zero yet? Well, keep working,
Yeah, exactly. And it's like there was never the insight of like you can differentiate on this dimension that like is a little bit counterintuitive if you're just glancing at it. But if you think about it for a second, it's like if you're running an observability platform for customers, that's your product. Your customer doesn't notice if it takes a few hundred milliseconds for your ingest pipeline to receive data. Like it does not matter in the grand scheme of things because there's this whole pipeline that needs to happen, that needs to run to process that data before it can ever be displayed on a graph in your product.
And I remember, I think it was the summer of 2022, like you could check me on that, but reading that blog post and just kind of WarpStream coming on my radar and realizing...
It was 23.
Yeah. 23. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Okay. Realizing I don't know what the demand elasticity of latency really is. Like how many people, if you could give them half the price or a tenth of the price or, do that, but it takes a second, how many people care? Like I didn't know. And it was just, it was that same revelation. Like, wow, that could be 90% of the market that just doesn't care. I still don't think we really know that, but it was very interesting. Yeah, revolutionary.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that. So I read that blog post. I literally just emailed like founders@warpstream.com.
Nice.
And I was like, hey guys, like you seem to have some good ideas. You seem pretty smart. If you ever need a product person, let me know. And they replied being like, yeah, we're 3 people right now. Like,
well, so that was a valid alias they had created. Okay.
Too early. No. I mean, they said like in the CTA, like the call to action at the bottom of the blog post was like, email founders if you're interested.
Okay.
So I did. I was interested for a different reason, just because it seemed like a very interesting problem, and it was also, very. It was early. It was like early in a startup's life cycle. It's just I'd never done that before. I wanted to get that experience. There was a lot going for it, basically, in my mind. So they were basically just it's too early, like whatever. Let's keep talking. And then like a week later, it was like, just kidding. We're gonna raise a Series A because VCs read this blog post and they want to invest in our company. Would you like to talk more seriously? I was like, yeah, okay, cool. Let's do this. Yeah. So I joined WarpStream December 2023. And about 8 months later, we were, in the early talks with Confluent and ended up joining Confluent. And the way that happened was pretty interesting. I mean, it at first, we didn't really know what to make of it. We're like, what does Confluent really want to do with WarpStream? Like they've got freight clusters. Like what do they want with us? So we had a meeting in Mountain View. We all went to Mountain View and met with a bunch of people on the Confluent side, and we kind of got some confidence there that the intent was not to like put us on a shelf, that we were a threat to their business or anything like that. We felt like it was very additive, and that like they the team very much wanted like another line of business. The BYOC deployment model was like the thing that made it tick, and like that that was a really good process for us to go through. I think that if it was if it was a different situation with a different parent company, I think that it would be slightly different dynamic for sure. And maybe it would have worked out differently or whatever, but we didn't even think that way. We were just like, okay, Confluent wants to add on this new line of business. We're a good way to do that.
Yes.
And it was very additive, so it was good. Yeah.
Excellent. How would you? I love that arc. I love that story. If you had to summarize the problem you solve, so kind of warp stream is the answer. What's the hardest problem you ever solved? Well, warp stream. You as the PM there,
Yeah.
Summarize that through that lens, like as a life scale problem, challenge, cool thing that you're doing. What is it that you do? You talked about being a PM, but like as a problem, what is the problem?
Do you mean like what problem does WarpStream solve as a product, or what problem am I solving for?
Okay, that's actually worth, in case there's anybody listening who doesn't know.
Sure.
In fact, I'll take a swing at that. You tell me. How
okay,
to do.
Go for it. Yeah.
WarpStream is a diskless Kafka, so it is a system that implements the APIs and semantics of Kafka, but doesn't store data on any locally attached or network attached storage. It's all stored in cloud blob stores. This is a trend in data infrastructure. Pick a form of data infrastructure, and we can identify the one or two groups doing an open source project to disklessify that. And so it's a lower cost, higher latency way of being data infrastructure that also gives you BYOC characteristics. So all of the data is stored in, say, your S3 bucket under your cloud control, not under WarpStreams, not under Confluence. So give me a WarpStream pitch here. Kind of cool thing about it is it's a very thorough BYOC, because like most BYOC implementations, the vendor can get in there and break glass if they have to and go in and fix stuff in the data plane. But here it's just, there's no glass. It's out there and nobody can do anything. So yeah, it's BYOC diskless Kafka. That's what WarpStream does. You're a PM there. Yeah. So you've kind of solved that. I guess that's the problem you've solved.
Well, no, there's a ton. I mean, like, there's a ton of potential, directions that we could go. There's infinite universes.
Sure.
But my role here is to basically help us pick the direction that makes our customers the most better off. Meaning, what else do people want to use our platform for? The deployment model provides some interesting possibilities for, like you were talking about. It runs in your account, in your VPC, or in your data center even, and just egresses metadata out. So with that in mind, like there's some use cases where maybe we could like lean into that with some more product features to make it, good for very highly sensitive workloads that, you wouldn't ever want to put on a cloud service. So that's one sort of category of things we can do. There's, the scaling element of like the scalability of the platform is another sort of thing we can sort of explore. For example, we recently sort of rebuilt our storage engine to be able to support basically huge amounts of data retention, because we had a couple of customers who were saying basically that like we have infinite retention on compacted topics and we want to store data forever. We just expect this to keep growing forever. And so, we need you to be able to support that. And it's not like, okay, cool, now we can just like forever into infinity support all the data you could ever store in a Kafka cluster, in a WarpStream cluster, but we 10x'd it. We made it so that you could store, huge amounts of data. And, there's more work to be done there to like figure out, under the hood, whether that's like, we basically, we extended the timeline that we have as a streaming platform, they're all always writing more data in, and if it never gets
Yes.
truncated, it just keeps growing. So there's some roadmap items there. I think the most exciting thing though right now that we're working on is WarpStream table flow. And so if you're not
Oh.
familiar with what table flow is, yeah, I mean this is an EA now. We've released it sort of in early access.
And we're speaking in
G-
early to mid-November of 2025. If you're
Correct.
listening to
I
this
don't know
in
when this will
some
be published.
future
Yes.
timeline, yeah.
Yeah, it might be GA by the time this goes live.
Probably won't be GA by the time this goes live, but yeah, long tail viewers in the future.
Yeah, exactly. So WarpStream TableFlow basically does the same thing as Confluent Cloud TableFlow. It materializes your Kafka topics as iceberg tables in object storage. WarpStream has the BYOC deployment model, which Tim, you described pretty well. The data plane runs in the customer's VPC with zero access delegated to us. And so there's no cross-account IAM privileges. So it all runs in your VPC. We don't have any access to the actual data. Your workload egresses metadata to our control plane, which is basically the brain of the operation. And so what we're doing with TableFlow is we basically created a new cluster type that the WarpStream agent, which is the replacement for the broker, the Kafka broker that runs in your environment. Instead of doing the Kafka job, it does the iceberg job. It writes Parquet files, takes an input from a Kafka topic, writes Parquet files in object storage, builds the metadata manifest thing, and ships the metadata about that back to our control plane. And just like Confluent Cloud TableFlow, it's a fully managed table, meaning like TableFlow handles all of the TableFlow agents handle all the background jobs like file compaction.
Compaction is the biggie.
Cleaning up orphan files, deletes, things like that. And so it's more of a managed service than, for example, using like the Kafka Iceberg connector, because you still have to figure out like how to manage the table and how to manage the data in object storage and like how to do all these operations, which TableFlow automates for you.
Yeah.
So that's why we say it's sort of a managed service with a BYOC deployment model, because it all runs in your account, but it automates a ton of the tedious work that you need to do if you were trying to build an iceberg, data lake yourself.
No, I'm not here to shill, but TableFlow really is pretty great. It's a really good idea.
Easy button. Yeah. I mean, the thing that people need to understand about Iceberg is that it's a table format. It's a building block. Like it's not a data lake in itself. It's a way to express how to store data in object storage such that it can be used as a data lake queryable with a SQL query engine.
Yes.
That's like a small part of building a database. And what we've done, Richie and Ryan like to say that like WarpStream TableFlow is kind of the bottom half of a database. It's like the back end, like primitives, and we're going to build more on top of it. But like that's how to think about it. It's sort of it makes the building blocks a lot more useful and a lot more easy to adopt.
Right. If you had to reflect, and it's early. I mean, WarpStream is young and growing and still having its impact, but so far, what do you think the impact of it has been?
WarpStream was, if not the first, one of the first diskless Kafka iterations. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that we pioneered sort of this idea. We didn't know it at the time that it was going to be, that it was going to have the effect that it would have on the industry. But we pioneered this idea that you can sacrifice latency in order to gain huge amounts of cost savings, specifically infrastructure cost savings. And, now that you sort of poke your head up and look around, there's an open source Kafka. There's 3 open source Kafka proposals currently in debate. There's, multiple vendors in the space. Confluent has a managed service that, basically is built on a lot of the primitives that WarpStream is built on, which is freight clusters in Confluent Cloud. It's like the fully hosted version of what we do. And so, I think that the industry, I don't know if it was like, I don't know what the direction of causality there is. But it definitely seems like we influenced the direction of the industry by just taking the first step to just be like, there's a possibility that latency doesn't matter as much as you think it does. Let's just test that out and see. And I think that, we gained a lot of sort of traction, early on with that idea. And I think that, it caught on very quickly. It's been super interesting to be a part of it. Yeah.
My guest today has been Caleb Grillo. Caleb, thanks for being a part of the Confluent Developer Podcast.
Thank you, Tim.